This fall, bring the beauty of the Rabbit Room into your own community with House Moot. It's a self-hosted gathering where your living room, church, or backyard becomes a place for shared stories, songs, and sacred conversations. With recorded sessions, recipes, activities, discussion questions, and a gathering guide, we'll set the table for you. All you have to do is bring the guests. Get everything you need to host your own House Moot at rabbitroom.com/housemoot.
For us, the most beautiful shape in the world is the parabola, right? For our ancestors, the most beautiful shape in the world is the circle. And I think it's because by creating these recurrent patterns, we're trying to capture these precious but fugitive moments in which we get glimpses of our best selves at our best moments, and we want to try to make those last as long as possible. Someone should tell the world that's what literature does.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Jason M. Baxter is a speaker, a college professor, and the author of 8 books, including The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Comedy, Why Literature Matters, and now a new translation of Dante's Comedy. On his Substack, Beauty Matters, he writes about the role of the humanities in our technologically driven age. He currently works at Benedictine College in Kansas as the director for the Center of Beauty and Culture. In this episode, Dr. Baxter and I talk about why literature matters and how the arts begin to close the gap between who we are and what we long for. Jason Baxter, I am so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. I love your book, Why Literature Still Matters, which has a subtitle, but we're not going to get into it.
I know. I was. Unfortunately, it does have a subtitle. I thought it was good, but then I discovered your antipathy for subtitles. But yes,
the subtitle is what? Literature after the reading after the apocalypse.
Beauty after the apocalypse.
Beauty after the apocalypse. Well,
but it's a digital.
It's a lovely
apocalypse.
Subtitle.
As far as subtitles go, it's not bad. No. Right, good.
What is the short answer to the question why literature still matters?
Man, I need to get better at the short answer.
All right, give me a long answer. That's okay.
Maybe I could give you a medium answer.
Okay.
Is that we're not very good at inwardness anymore. And that we think that as a culture, we think that all of our problems have technological and practical solutions. In other words, we think in terms of externality. But I would say maybe not all, but a lot of our problems are really only solvable by questions of inwardness, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a question of not necessarily how I act and what I do, but who I am. And literature is the great technology of our ancestors. It's a technology for inwardness. And that's why it still matters, is because it's therapeutic at helping me, and I say this sometimes in the context of Dante, but Dante would just be one specific example, right? It's therapeutic in that it connects head knowledge with heart knowledge. Yeah. It slows time down, and it makes what Lewis calls value memorable, and I call sort of sticky in terms of its language and imagery, so that as I get into it as a reader and participate in its landscape, it gets into me. Inwardness. I guess I do have a short answer. It promotes inwardness. Technology for promoting inwardness.
And why are you using the word technology? That's an odd word.
Yeah, I guess I just mean a tool, a practice, a methodology. A techne, exactly. And I mean, I know we tend to think of technology exclusively in terms of electronics and screens and so forth, right? But some sort of tool which is calculated to do more work, to accomplish more than you could without its assistance, right? But I think if we think of our literature as this tool for amplifying this sense of inwardness, then we can talk about it as a technology, even if it's not glowing.
Yeah. If it's not glowing, that's good. Well, so I want to get back to something you touched on just then, and that is that a technology allows us to do more than we could do without it. I guess the idea is there are other ways to grow our inwardness besides literature, but literature speeds up the process, I guess, or art speeds up the process of or leverages our ability to do that work.
Yeah, that's a great
Is that fair?
question. I think, yeah. How do you actually tease all these things out? Certainly, in a religious tradition, prayer; in a liturgical tradition, right? Liturgical formation, right? Attending liturgical services in some Christian traditions, right? A sacramental experience. I think all of these ways are ways to cultivate this inwardness. I think maybe part of the power of literature is that it's specific to particular places and particular values and particular characters. That is, if I guess in some sense, if the grace in one traditional definition is the supernatural gift, which enables me to perceive the divine, who is outside of time, and thus for which I do not entirely have all the required powers. So grace is this sort of uplifting, as Aquinas talks about it, of my very ability to see. Right. It seems that literature, in the way, is as Lewis sort of describes it. Right. There are these sort of temporary moments in which I catch glimpses of my best self, right? The moment of reunion, right? A certain type of relationship of tenderness, a certain type of heroism, of courage, or Lewis describes these in that hideous strength, right? In the Descent of the Gods, that these astrological deities, which Lewis thought still possessed spiritual symbolic significance for us, right? Bring these different types, either the ability to be nobly in love, the ability to embrace comradeship with hardiness, right? The ability to think with subtlety, but also with humor, right? All these different, the ability to have a festive spirit, but also to have a kind of, as Lewis describes it, a saturnine depth. Lewis, thought that the secret magic of literature was that it created what he called poema, that its madeness created a type of net. And in this net of plot and details and what he jokingly calls the logic of fairy, right? Logos, or some type of intellectual sentiment or statement or concept, could get caught within this net of poema. But when we capture it, it's not just something that we think and refer to, but it's something that we hope, to a certain extent, as I jokingly say in the book, even though I have some criticism of our technological devices, right? It's when we download them, we're no longer streaming. And so I think for Lewis, as he talked about, it's the net which captures that elusive bird. But it's these types of things like generosity or depth or comradeship or being nobly in love, or be a fun question to ask. Hey, Lewis, how many of these different values are there? How many different keys are there on your sort of piano keyboard of the heart? I suspect there's something like 27, but
27,
27, yeah, something in that neighborhood, right? Yeah,
yeah. Well, I like this idea of that. I think you used the phrase "our better selves," and as you know from having written things, Jason Baxter, in the written form, is just a little smarter, a little wiser, a little kinder. Probably, I don't know. Maybe you are as wise and as kind as you appear in writing, but for most of us, that's a better self that ends up in the written form.
It's true.
And then when I receive that as a reader, I am connecting to that better self and realize there's something, some better self that exists in me, or that could exist, or that, that again, you're using the word technology, that technology of elevation, of edification. It's amazing to listen to a piece of music and have the brain waves happening in my brain that happened in Bach's brain. I have no way of making that kind of music, and yet when I hear that music, I am making that music in a sense.
Right.
And that's a miracle. And the same thing happens with literature.
So many things to say to that. I mean, at the risk of revealing myself as a narcissist to your listeners, I do have moments. I mean, so I've recorded the book for an audiobook, which should be out any week or so, and I'm really excited about that. But while I was reading it, I was sort of tearing up at my own passages. And my first thought was, I better not tell my wife this, right? This is going to be like, proof of everything that she's been afraid of.
Yeah.
But my second thought was, this is what Bernard of Clairvaux was talking about. Bernard has this great moment in which he ends one of his sermons, and he says, "I've ascended in my words. Would that I could ascend in my heart." Right? Yeah. And I think you're right. I've sort of spoken out loud my best self, right? The sentiments of my best self, right? That if I were free of wrath, if I were vigilant in my prayer, more vigilant than I am, if I did have a sort of a sense of generosity and fearlessness, I think I sort of speak those kind of aspirational desires. But I think what we trust in terms of literature, and this is the exciting and bold claim, is that we're not hypocrites because there's a gap, because we believe that literature has this type of therapeutic value, this poetic value, that over the course of time, with practice and getting good at it, and then of course, I don't know. I mean, maybe I guess you could say what literature does is it ignites the desire in the heart to pray. And when you pray, that's when the sort of the gap closing actually happens. And so literature is this kind of like proto prayer, right?
Yeah.
The medievals say that the medieval Dominicans said that first the bow is bent in study, right? That is, if you want to have prayer which is efficacious and which just whips out there like an arrow from a taut string, you have to pull the bow back, of course. You have to pull the string back and put tension on it. And how do you do that? Well, the Dominicans are a very learned order, right? They believe in the cultivation of the intellect. But they say the process of putting tension on the bow is study. And so I think maybe just to borrow that slightly, I think we could say, first, the bow of prayer is bent in poetry. That is, I think we sometimes encounter these characters. I mean, it could be good or bad, right? We encounter sort of Flaubert's Madame Bovary, right? Mm-hmm. We encounter my new sort of favorite person to pick on, the character Phileas Fogg from Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. That was probably the most fun I had in writing the whole book was picking on poor old Phileas Fogg.
Yeah,
right?
you were hard on Fogg.
I really was, and in fact, I've given some talks on this to school teachers and to secondary school teachers who just love reading this with their high school students, and you can see it causes them a type of moral crisis. Yeah. Like, oh no, this man of efficiency that I was presenting to my high school students doesn't seemingly to have what I call that depth along the z-axis, and it's causing them moral dilemmas.
Yeah.
But in any case, I think we can encounter these negative characters, right, who we think are shallow. And of course, if it's a good writer, we sympathize with that character. As Flaubert himself said, right? Madame Bovary, c'est moi, right? It's me. I just wrote myself into this person, right? And then I think as with good writers, and if we're good readers, we feel that sort of pained complicity, right? And with that sort of pained complicity, now we've actually got something to work with, right? I guess you could say now the bow is bent, or analogously. I've already mentioned that passage in That Hideous Strength, right? You read sort of Lewis's description of when the martial spirit comes down and fills everyone's hearts. And they sort of look around at each other and say, it'd be an honor to die with such as these. And I know in my best moments, right, I've felt about my friends like that, right? Yeah. What we have right now, it is enough. And I think that kind of fearlessness of the temptations of the wiles and bribes of a vain world temporarily melt away. Oh, but if you could get good at that, if that could become a permanent state of your being. And I know we're talking about why literature still matters, and I want to stay there, but I do think that's exactly what Dante's doing in his Purgatorio, which is also fresh on my mind because I just finished my translation of it, right? But I think that's something that Dante sees, right? Is that downloading and that getting good at, right? So it's not just this. It's not a thing that I know I ought to do, right? It's not a correct opinion that I hold in my brain, but it's something I want so bad that little by little, I become like it in my very being. That's what I want to do. And I think in my imperfect and limited experience of the literary life, something like that, not as much as I like, but something like that has happened in me and in my students. And that's why ultimately, although the subtitle does have the word apocalypse in it, it ultimately is an optimistic book, even if I also suggest that there's a real sense of urgency that I almost wanted to call it why you should read literature while you still can. But I kind of backed off that very sort of, I don't want to go full on Cormac McCarthy there.
Well, I agree that this is ultimately an optimistic book that you've written. I ran across something the other day that said it's possible that the internet has gotten so junky and so stupid thanks to AI and so unreliable that maybe people are going to just be a little tired of it and ready for something else. I hope that's true.
I hope so. I have my doubts.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't get tired of potato chips or Cheetos, do we? I mean, the chemists know what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they can kind of get in there and poke just the right taste buds, right, to create this incredible sensation, right?
Yeah. I avoided Flaming Hot Cheetos until about 1.5 years ago, and I love them, man. They are so good.
See?
I know.
And that's what the internet is, Flaming Hot Cheetos, right? I mean, I think, I actually, I'm completely with you. I think this is incredibly interesting period. I mean, I think AI is a huge scam. And I think the best thing that we can do is we can try to make AI unprofitable. That is, we got to stop using it. We got to stop being such tools and paying for it, right? And then just stop using it, and then it will collapse because it's a profit-driven, segment. And they're all and people are the big guys, right? Like OpenAI are worried about its profitability at the very moment. So I think we can help it collapse by just stop being such tools and think for a change, right? But I do think I had an incredible experience just a couple weeks ago. I had a couple of young folks who were trying to sell me as a professor artificial intelligence proof writing software. And they had, have an interesting sort of scheme for that. I was, halfway interested. I told them, you know what? I'm more interested in like going back to the age of the wheel, right? I want to give my students like a piece of paper and a pen and say, okay, let me teach you how to write on a legal pad, right? Because that's how I still write. They didn't really like that. But they've also have a sort of tool which they've built into it, which the professor can control the amount of AI that the students are allowed to use. So you can kind of, big brother them, surveillance state them while they're writing for you, right? I said, all right, let's just, and he said, well, it's a valuable writing tool. And I said, well, let's see how valuable. And I said, tell it to write an annotated bibliography of the Parthenon. Because I've got an analog one written by a scholar who spent 30 years studying this. And the AI one and then the Parthenon one, we compared them. Well, what I found, it was super fascinating, is that the AI generated annotated bibliography. Of course, it just casts its net out there and drags in a haul of words wherever it finds. So it was drawing descriptions, not value descriptions from scholars who have read a book and said, let me tell you how I think about it. But it was drawing descriptions by blurbers and endorsers. In other words, by the marketers. Yeah. AI can't distinguish between a description written by a marketer and a blurber and an evaluative assessment of someone who spent the time to try to to test the value of it. AI doesn't know. And so it gave this list. What that means, of course, is that it's completely prey to whoever who can, produce the most verbiage, right? Yeah. Because it's just an averaging machine. Yeah. If I can say, if I had AI bots writing for me about why literature still matters, right? And I could, and I could say it's the greatest book of our century, right? And if I could say that often enough, whoever criticizes it would just be drowned, be an outlier in the average. Thus, ultimately, I think writing is going to move into the hands of those who have the power to manipulate our value judgments. Anyway, so I think this is a great time to think for ourselves. And Substack said the other day in a fascinating article that 50% of their writers admit to using artificial intelligence generatively for their pieces, right? So we're just
50%.
yeah, we're just
And then there's some who lie about it, so that puts us above 50%.
that's right. Yeah, so I think I hope you're right, Jonathan. I hope that we'll get a little contrary, as Wendell Berry says, right? There's a world of pleasure in contrariness, as he says in one of his poems, right? And I hope we will get a little contrary, and I hope that we will kind of re-embrace this unique faculty of the human heart and the human mind of producing inwardness, and value that. But I think in the meantime, I think it's going to be hard because they have all the resources to use against us, including hiring the best cognitive psychologist in the world to make us almost incapable of not staying on, even if we don't enjoy it. I mean, talk about an addiction, right?
Yeah.
For those who smoked in their past, very unpopular now, right? But for those who smoked in their past, probably know the experience of lighting a new cigarette off an old cigarette, and the disappointment of not getting the pleasure of that first drag on the second cigarette. You're tired of it. You're sick of it. It's no longer pleasurable. And you also feel that you can't stop. I think that's how we feel with respect to our devices and our internet. And we're gonna have to do something, or we'll just keep smoking. Smoking flaming hot Cheetos.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Let's talk about you've mentioned inwardness a few times. You also, I appreciate the way you talk about that literature feels similar to being immersed in a landscape.
Yeah.
Which it seems to me is that's about externality, about looking outward. Let's talk about that. I mean, is it?
Yeah.
What's the relationship between the outward? I mean, any literature that doesn't have an outwardness. I mean, even C.S. Lewis talks about he loves books with weather.
Yes,
I do too.
Right.
And so, what's the relationship between the outwardness that literature invites us? I mean, in some ways, you make the case that the internet and social media traps us in this sort of solipsism, where everything is about me, 100% you.
100% you, yeah.
And yet, obviously, that's different from interiority. It seems to me what I love about literature, poetry, is the way it pulls me out of myself.
Yes. Right.
And expands myself.
Right.
Rather than shrinking myself. Let's talk
right.
about that. Let's talk about the relationship between externality and inwardness that you're talking about.
Yeah, so many awesome questions. I think, Tim Ingold, the anthropologist, makes the distinction between wayfaring and transportation. And I think wayfaring is what I mean by being immersed in the landscape.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, kind of with C.S. Lewis, not having that landscape mediated by means of a metal body around me, but as Lewis said, walking on human feet and going at the scale of the human being, not at the scale of the combustion engine.
Yeah.
Because I think when you get at the scale of the combustion engine, what happens is this experience of the quantification of the world. I'm not experiencing the shades of meaning, the qualitative interactions that come through all of my senses, right? Or even the landscapes. I'm just counting mile markers, right? Especially if my wife falls asleep in the passenger seat and I can speed without her yelling at me, right? I'm like, all right, if I go 17 miles an hour faster than I should, then until she, right? Our whole experience.
I'm always doing math when I drive.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm always thinking about the
Exactly.
quantification.
Exactly. And I think when we just get that level of power, we have to start thinking in these semi-abstract categories, right, of scientific notation. I mean, certainly we know that, the scientists at Los Alamos were thinking in terms of scientific notation, right? Like, 10 times 10 to the, whatever power of megatons of force, right? Yeah. When we get to this level, we have these sort of semi-abstractions, we lose the qualitative, right? Of course, being immersed in a landscape is different. And then, of course, that's my Sardinia story, right? How to Die in Sardinia. Is that in of course, I tell the story in which I almost died of heat stroke and dehydration, and found myself just trying to cool off, sitting in a mud on a mud floor in a stone hut, which I think was probably a 15th century watchtower, Catalan watchtower. I like to fancy maybe even a hermitage, right?
Yeah.
And I was sitting in the mud, right? And I started to smile. And then, as I say, I smiled at my smiling. Like, this is ludicrous, right? Why would you spend so much money to go sit in the mud, right? I mean, I could have done that in the backyard.
Yeah.
But of course, what I conclude in that is that, well, I had actually become part of the ecosystem, right? The gap between what's out there and me had closed. That's, I think, the immersive, that's the best possible sort of immersive landscape. And I think that's why we admire folk cultures in addition to high art cultures. Right? Because high art cultures, I think, are able to capture that weather, that atmosphere, right? That air of a place. But folk culture is too, right?
Yeah.
If you can find, people, they don't really, it's hard to find these days because tourism has kind of obliterated this, right? But if you can really find the local Florentine, right, who can close his eyes and walk through the city in his mind, right? Then in some sense, what the high artist has, and he also just sort of possesses in his being. So I think that's what we're kind of looking for, is that sense of immersion in which I sort of joyfully become part of the ecosystem, such that, as I say, its emotions become my emotions. And then in that kind of rich, complicated, multi-layered, multi-sensory, slow time experience, that's a huge term for me, as opposed to the combustion engine, right? As opposed to how our devices encourage us not to get behind, this is trending, this chat has moved on Slack, and it's all sort of a quantitative experience, right? But literature and landscape have these slow time, multi-sensory, multi-layered experiences, which I say slows time down. And in its very effort to have what I call the sticky language of poetry, it resists the linear flow of time and tries to make these kind of recurrent little circular patterns in which, for a brief moment, my time is just a little bit more like eternity. I think that's what I sort of write about. That's really the poetry of literature, is by means of this multisensory complex experience, giving us a sense of slow time. Now, we can't exit from time, of course, completely, and that's okay. But it is. But as soon as you think of it like that, then you start to realize that our ancestors were obsessed with this. In general, I think our art now, I lovingly poke fun at not only Phileas Fogg, but also the painter Roy Lichtenstein. Cormac McCarthy has some passages like this. Ernest Hemingway certainly writes like this. In the second half of the 20th century, you have this almost kind of capitulation to the world of the machine. Like, the Marinettis and the futurism, and they just say, all right, fine, let's make art, and Updike has moments like this too, in addition to slow time, right? Sure. Let's just hit the accelerator as hard as we can. Let's create art like that, right? And there's a sort of I think a just sort of acquiescence to our acceleration culture. But our ancestors were interested in almost the exact opposite. Spenser's wedding song, his epithalamium, wants to take that iconic moment for most of us in our lives, right, that beautiful wedding day, and make it as slow and layered as possible, as polyphonic as possible. Yeah. But also since then I've come across some great examples, like John Donne's La Corona, The Crown. Yeah. And it's 7 sonnets. The last line of each sonnet is the first line of the following. And the final line of the final sonnet is the first line of the first. And so, in some sense, Donne wants to break the linear pattern of this and create a crown which circles and gives you the feeling almost, like you're listening to Bach or Ockeghem, or you're looking at the perpendicular ceilings of a late Gothic English cathedral. In some sense, by creating these as I say, for us, the most beautiful shape in the world is the parabola. Right? I don't want linear growth. I want growth of my growth. Right? Yeah. I need acceleration. Right? I can't just make, a static, 3% profit. I need to make more profit than I made last year in order to keep my investors interested. Right? That's so for us, the most beautiful shape in the world is the parabola, right? For our ancestors, the most beautiful shape in the world is the circle.
Yeah.
And I think it's because by creating these recurrent patterns, we're trying to capture these precious but fugitive moments in which we get glimpses of our best selves at our best moments, and we want to try to make those last as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Someone should tell the world that's what literature does, right?
Yeah.
That's what English departments should be doing. That's what music departments should do, and art classes should be doing. But that's why this matters. And anytime I get a chance to tell a bunch of college students that this is the purpose of it, they go, "Oh,"
Yeah.
and then they're hooked.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even when you talk about the monkeying with time in literature, I think this gets back to what I was saying earlier about the reason you're able to be a better version of Jason Baxter in writing is because you're not doing it in real time. I can be much more patient and much more kind when I don't have the stimuli coming at me in real time, when I can slow down and go and really think, really consider, and say, oh, that sentence there is just a little bit more petulant than I would want to be. And I can clean that up. And then again, as we receive that and we have the vision of a less petulant way of talking, a less petulant way of arguing, or I think that the fact that literature doesn't happen, we neither make it nor receive it in real time, whereas social media is more or less real time.
That's kind of beautiful. I mean, if I can just sort of translate what you've said, the very art of writing is a kind of laboratory experiment on myself in the conditions of slow time.
Yeah.
You could say, okay, writing is a self-experimentation in the laboratory of slow time. And yeah, I think so. I love it. I mean, our ancestors, of course, have a word for that. They call it recollection, right? In which Augustine uses it, of course, in his Confessions, right? In which I take all these fugitive, quick emotions that I experience in the midst of time, and I sort of draw them back toward a more central core of my being. And of course, for Augustine, right, that the center of the core is where I'll say it again, my best self encounters, and indeed is encountering, and in fact always has encountered, the living God, even if I myself am rarely aware of that. But Augustine, of course, conducts this magnificent experiment, and then when she goes back and finds God sort of hidden behind the corners of the moments in which he himself, Augustine, was not aware that he was there.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of act of recollection is, I think that's what I'm talking about.
Great. Hey, before we run out of time, I want to make sure we talk about the idea. You've barely touched on it in this conversation. You have touched on it, but the gap. As you say, beauty at the center of our experience of beauty is this gap between who we are and what we want. To perceive something that's beautiful, there's an ache there because we can't actually be everything that we want. And literature, as you say, closes that gap. Mm-hmm. I'm opening the floor for you to sort of articulate that idea better than I can.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, again, that's kind of in this chapter, How to Die in Sardinia, and part of the argument is that the reason I was so happy being out in this landscape was because, to a certain extent, that gap had closed. But I'd had this incredible experience where I'd seen some supremely beautiful things. Of course, in the Italian mind, Sardinia, the coast of Sardinia, is the Platonic paradigm of coastal beauty. And we discovered this when we went to some really beautiful beaches in Liguria, and the Italians would look sort of wistfully at it and said, yeah, it's almost Sardinian. At which point we looked at each other like, we got to go check this place out. We got to go see what is the Platonic form of beauty for the Italians, right? And so you see these coasts, you see these water, of course, you see that Mediterranean sky, and you think, oh, it's so gorgeous. But then you also know, well, I mean, I can snap a photo of it. I can text it to people back home, but that's not enough. That's not enough. And you find, just like Lewis, right? You find yourself turning around and asking yourself, well, what do you want? And you find yourself saying strange things like, I don't know, I want to eat beauty. I want to reach out there and hold it, and I want to bite it and chew it and swallow it, digest it, metabolize it so that it becomes a little part of me. I want that sky to illuminate I want it to illuminate my soul, right? I want that, I want that sublime mountainous landscape to have something analogous. Well, lo and behold, there's a long tradition, especially in Romanticism, but you find it not only in Lewis and Romanticism, but you find it poking its head up, in antiquity as well. There's a long tradition that the world out there is keyed, tuned to our soul, that our soul is what our ancestors called a microcosm.
Yeah.
And the world out there is this macrocosm. But it's almost if I just go out there and have an experience, right? What every millennial wants the most. I just want experience, right? I want experience more than salary. I want experience more than stability, right? If I just go out there and have an experience, part of the pain of that is that it's evanescent and it evaporates almost immediately. And it doesn't do anything to me. And I think that hurts. I think the exciting thing about the arts, about painting, about literature, about music, both in terms of producing them as writers and artists, but also in terms of, I won't say consuming because I think that's kind of a disgusting term, but of absorbing them into our being, is that I think it takes that fugitive sentiment, that awakeness that beauty brings, and tries to wrap my arms around it and hold it as long as I can, with the hope that while I am in this, enjoying this type of aesthetic experience as enhanced, amplified by art or writing, then just a little bit, I'll get some of that spaciousness within my own heart, and that'll awaken the analogous sentiment which has been sleeping in my heart until I came across the moment of beauty in which I hit the tuning fork out there, and come to find out I had the exact same tuning fork at the same pitch inside of my heart, and it begins to vibrate just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that's what education is for, and I think that's what literature is for us to heal our own solipsistic loneliness and isolation in which I'm just me, by reintegration therapy. Maybe some of your listeners will catch that allusion, right? Reintegration therapy with the world, with nature. I think that's why God gave us creation. I think that's why we respect it. I think that's why we paint it. I think that's why we play it in music, why we compose it like the Hebrides, right? And I think that's why we write it in our poetry. That's why we consume it, because we recognize that to get a fugitive glance of beauty out of the corner of my eye is a good thing indeed, but to turn toward it and hold it as long as possible by means of my art is a gift. And just short of a spiritual experience, or maybe even or we could even say a proto-spiritual experience, right? Yeah. The very use of my natural faculties to move into a domain in which something bigger than me, more beautiful than me, is actually beginning to take place, even if a little bit. Yeah. I always just encourage myself, hey, it's not who I am right now, it's who I would be if I didn't have these things. Right? And that, I do believe in growth, and I do believe in slow transformation, but that's what I wanted to say in this book.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor talks about the habit of art is using the senses to see as much meaning as possible in things. Yeah. And I love that idea that it's the sense. We're using senses, not skipping over the senses to get to something spiritual, but the habit of art is to use the senses to see as much meaning as possible. To stay on the surface in one sense, but in order to see below the surface.
Right.
And you've already talked about prayer, this process by which maybe in prayer, ideally, you can short circuit some of the sensory experience and go straight to the spiritual, but the work of art, we don't have the option of short-circuiting the sensory.
I bet your listeners are better at praying than I am. But I would say most of the time for me, if I haven't bent the bow and study, if I pray, it's just my sort of biological animal expressing the anxieties of the day. Yeah. Lord, can I make it to 3:37 today? And right? And I think that for me, that sort of prayer is kind of on the surface, right? But I think that what you said of regaining the power to see different things, people and landscapes and events as what the French philosopher Jean-Luc Marion calls the saturated phenomena, right? In which there's more meaning out there than there should be. It's too rich, it's too good, it's too abundant. And as soon as I see that, and I don't always see it, right? I don't always see it, and maybe that's the variability of art, is for us to see that once again. But when I do see it, I go, can it really be? And I think then you're in the hinterlands of prayer, right? When you go, can it really be? Because the next step is, oh God, do something with me for a change, right? But I think that sort of that natural experience that we have of stupefaction and awe and wonder is, for most of us, is the entry point into those to the high country of deep spiritual experiences.
Yeah, so good. Thanks. All right. We are coming up on the end of my allotted 40 minutes. But I do want to hear your answer to the question of who are the writers that make you want to write?
Well, the low-hanging fruit is Lewis.
Yeah.
I love him so much. I've read him for so long that I feel like he's a friend. Plato, Dante, Gretel Ehrlich in her Solace of Open Spaces.
Don't know that. I don't know that author of that book.
Yeah, it's really good. She's writing in the 80s, and she was in the rat race in LA, and she's a writer, and she felt like she was becoming inauthentic in her writing, and so without telling anyone, she disappeared and went to Wyoming, and lived in the Bighorn Mountains as a sheep hand, and wrote this incredible sort of laconic, muscular prose about this laconic, muscular landscape of Wyoming. Anyway, so Gretel Ehrlich makes me believe that a writer can reach out there and touch a landscape and I don't know, put your head on its heart and listen to its heartbeat. Annie Dillard's Living Like Weasels, I think, does the same thing for me. Yeah. Paul Kingsnorth gets me really jazzed. I mean, he most of the time he's sort of articulating the disappearance of our ability to be rich. And that in turn makes me think, okay, well, I guess what I do is valuable, right? Yeah. But these days, I'm just in love with lyric poetry. I've been teaching a little online lyric poetry class this summer, and I find myself falling in love with authors that I was made to read in high school and didn't know I would ever return to. I mean, reading John Donne. I'm reading Milton's Lycidas. I'm reading lots of William Blake, like his Auguries of Innocence. So those are kind of old things, but right now I think the sort of the density, the neutrino star of lyric poetry is just absolutely captivated my imagination. And so I think maybe it's trying to inspire how I want to use my prose, even if you can't quite do what lyric poetry does.
Yeah.
I want the same results.
I'm coming back to a lot of the people I read in school, and just am realizing the extent to which I was invited or required not to receive, but to go straight to, what am I going to say about this? What am I going to, how am I going to judge and be judge, jury, and executioner on this poem? And now coming back to, I say a poem, I mean, for that matter, the Complete Angler. I came back to the Complete Angler, the Isaac Walton book about fishing, from the 17th century. And I was ready just to receive it instead of judging it. And it did a lot of good for me that it wasn't able to do for me when I was an academic and therefore required to say something about it.
Right. Yeah. Blake's got this line about to see the world in a wildflower seems like to see the cosmos in a fish.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. Jason Baxter, thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and hear you articulate your vision of things. So thank
you. This is so fun. It makes me want to write another book just in order to be on the podcast.
Excellent. Do it.
Okay. I've already done it. Bye.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.